Let's talk about cookies, specifically old cookies. I've been working on a video for Humoral Physiology and it's just taken forever. It'll be up, but it might take a little while longer. Remember, I don't practice humoral herbal medicine, I practice Chinese herbal medicine. So I'm figuring out the humoral medicine as I go and I'm sharing what I'm learning, and that takes a lot of research, especially because I don't want to get anything wrong. So instead of that giant video, what we're going to do is switch it up and talk about cookies because it's Christmas. And we're going to talk specifically about old cookies because old cookies have an herbal formula logic to them. They weren't the bland, sweet treats or desserts that we have today, like chocolate chip cookies or sugar cookies. Instead, they had huge flavors, and modern people probably really wouldn't even relate to them. And this is because they weren't really so much desserts as they were medicines. Or, depending upon the time period, they show the transition of spices used in the cookies from medicine to food. And that means they look kind of familiar, but the variety of spices and sheer amount of them in a recipe is a lot more and a lot larger. Because the cookies of the time had a medicinal function, there's an inner architecture to these old cookies that we mostly don't even notice anymore. And from an herbal point of view, that inner structure is really interesting. It shows what the cookie was meant to treat, which shows what people were dealing with at the time. From a humoral medicine point of view, one's environment and climate have a direct impact on health, and diseases reflect the place you live, in addition to bad lifestyle choices or just bad genetic luck. So a seasonal cookie that was more medicinal than it was sweet treat that showed up in Christmas and winter markets in the late medieval or pre-modern period says a lot about what health was like and what people dealt with. And we have the same bodies. We're not that far removed, so we can certainly get the same complaints these cookies were meant to treat. And so maybe as we learn about them, we can recognize ourselves in some of these old formulas. So let's take a very representative cookie, the Pfeffernüsse. What is a Pfeffernüsse? The Pfeffernüsse is one of those traditional German cookies like Lebkuchen or Springerle that most younger Americans have never heard of, let alone made. It has a very forward and complex flavor profile, which honestly really isn't saying much because modern cookies like sugar cookies or chocolate chip are tasty, but really boring. And when you look at many old recipes, you'll notice the spice amounts are generally a lot higher than modern recipes because spices weren't just flavors, they were medicinals. And being medicinals, the flavor wasn't entirely the point. Rather, the flavor pointed at the medicinal effect. The name Pfeffernuss means pepper nut. In German, Pfeffer means pepper, but in medieval times, Pfeffer just meant something spicy. Although, incidentally, later recipes actually do include black pepper. And it's called a nut because it's a small ball the size and shape of a nut. So you could think of it as pepper nuts or spicy nuts. And the spice blend could not be more Christmassy. There's cinnamon, cardamom, clove, nutmeg, anise, often citrus peel, ginger, and usually a little black pepper. So where did Pfeffernusse come from? The earliest recipe is attributed to Johann Fleischmann in 1753. He was a confectioner in Offenbach am Main, but that really doesn't mean much because he was just the first person to write it down. Or, more likely, his recipe book is the oldest one that survived. But that doesn't mean he invented the cookie, because he most certainly did not. These kind of cookies were widespread, especially among people who could afford spices. And you can easily find related recipes going back into the 16th and 17th centuries. One example is Alexander Peppernoten from a recipe book in Beningenberg in Grimmersund in East Frisia. And Peppernoten is Dutch, and the German would be Pfeffernüsse, and the English would be peppernuts. Alexander is Alexander the Great, which references the Eastern origin of the spices. You see Greek and Roman names in electuaries and formulas, so it's not out of place here. And in this context, it makes it sound fancy, until you consider that the name means Alexander the Great's spicy nuts. It uses many of the same ingredients, and I'll link that source below, but it is in German. So Pfeffernüsse, or Peppernoten, belong to a much older European tradition of Pfeffergebäck, which means spiced baked goods. Again, pfeffer in the medieval use meant spicy. These cookies were definitely seasonal and likely only available to certain levels of wealth. In the medieval period, spices would have been very expensive luxury goods or medicines. Just for context, we can look at one of the more expensive spices of the Middle Ages, which was kind of surprisingly cloves. And this is surprising because we don't really think much about cloves now and rarely use them. Are they in pumpkin pie? I don't even know. And it's one of those spices that if you don't have it, you can leave it out and no one's going to notice. It's not like cinnamon or nutmeg. I mean, we have cinnabuns, but we don't have any clovebuns. So you wouldn't think there'd be much demand. But you'd be wrong. It was hard to get. It only grew in the fabled spice islands in Indonesia. So its scarcity, along with its medicinal and culinary value, made it really expensive. Even though it was known in the West at least as far back as 1700 BCE, the amount of clove in circulation could not have reached the levels of cinnamon. It just didn't grow in enough places. In fact, the first circumnavigation of the world by Ferdinand Magellan in 1522 was entirely for the purpose of finding a quicker and cheaper route to the spice islands of Indonesia to obtain clove and nutmeg. And that voyage represented an enormous cost and risk. The fleet consisted of 5 fully equipped caravels and 270 men. And when the expedition finally made it back to Spain, it returned with only 18 men and 1 ship carrying 50 tons of cloves and nutmeg. And with only those 18 men returning on that 1 ship with 50 tons of cloves and nutmeg, the expedition was still considered a financial success. But by the 1700s, spices were slowly becoming more affordable, so they wouldn't have been totally unfamiliar to larger demographics. Still, unless you were very wealthy, you probably couldn't afford to eat them every day, and if you were poor, well, you were likely shit out of luck. And the time period of the recipes we're looking at shows this transition. It still keeps the medicinal dosing. And that's important because even if you were rich in Europe at the time and you weren't living in a hovel with 20 other people, houses were still cold and damp, and you were exposed to the elements to a much greater degree. The Pfeffernusse is a dry cookie, just like Lebkuchen and Springerle. And this can make it a little unpalatable for modern tastes, especially American tastes that need or want a kind of fatty richness in their desserts. So we can think of it kind of more like a dense biscotti. And Pfeffernusse were dry because they were meant to keep. They had to have a long shelf life, especially because if you're using expensive spices, you don't want them to spoil. And also to help them not spoil, they were made with honey and alkaline potash. And in that way, they were similar to monastic spice breads. So let's elaborate on the concept of food as medicine. This isn't something we are so familiar with in the modern world, where our medicines are generally strong pharmaceuticals. Because of that, we tend to not make the strong connection between what specific foods do to the body. And of course, it's tough in the modern world where we're not eating seasonally. We don't know who grew the food. We don't know where it came from. There are a lot of different variables. And if you're buying something off the shelf, oftentimes you don't even really know what's in it. But the point is, the things we eat have an effect upon us. Food is mostly neutral, which is why it's food. But spices and herbs push the body in a particular direction. They have pharmacological effects. So heavily spiced cookies, using cinnamon, clove, pepper, cardamom, ginger, anise, are in a very real way a kind of medicine. And this medicinal effect of spices is described differently in different systems. In modern medicine, it's described via TRP receptors, vasodilation, catecholamines, etc. In humoral medicine, it's described as warming, drying, carminative, or digestive. And things described as warming and drying are very helpful in climates described as cold and damp. There's a kind of economy and clarity of language when language is used in both a generally descriptive and diagnostically specific way, which makes it very, very user-friendly. You don't have to put concepts through some kind of abstract system translation process. As we know, humoral medicine considered that climate had an effect upon an organism. So, all things being equal, and with no other pre-existing conditions, a cold, damp environment will create a cold, damp digestion, which will manifest as such things as gas, bloating, loose stools, mucus, low appetite, fatigue, etc. So, warm and dry spices make a lot of sense in this context, and it makes a lot of sense that they would be called warm and dry. Because these cookies were seasonally appropriate, best in cold and damp winter, and because they were made with expensive spices that were not generally common everyday staples, but rather things used for special occasions, they showed up in Christmas markets. Hence, they were Christmas cookies. And the blend of warming spices were indicated not only for a cold and damp stomach, but also for a stomach that was overloaded with too much food to digest, which is functionally the same thing. So they were also popular as post-Christmas feast digestives. So to sum it up, in humoral logic, Pfeffernüsse were warming, drying, and circulating digestives. And they were helpful for thinning mucus, supporting weak digestion, and increasing appetite. And they would have been especially useful for people who were cold, weak, or elderly. And they would have been understood not just as a dessert, but as a medicinal food, at least in their older and less sweetened forms. Now, let's get a little more detailed in how these cookies function as herbal formulas. And to do so, we're going to have to pick a recipe. There are a lot of different versions of these cookies, so we need to pick something general. For that reason, we'll pick the modern version for the sake of the spices that are used, bearing in mind the amounts of fat, sugar, and spices are going to be very different. So let's take a look at the ingredients. The flour is pretty much the same, and the eggs are the same too. Where you see the big difference is in the sugar. In the traditional recipe, the maximum amount of sugar is generally about a cup. And the type of sugar is important too, because it's either honey or molasses or a mixture of both. And that's going to give the traditional recipe a different flavor profile. It's not going to be only sweet. Honey and molasses have bitter notes to them, which adds complexity to the overall flavor of the recipe. And also, honey and molasses have a different therapeutic effect than brown or white sugar. And by contrast, the modern recipe uses predominantly brown sugar with just a hint of molasses or maybe honey. And the amount it uses is much more. So that can be a cup and a half total, or it could even be a cup of each, brown sugar and molasses, for a total of 2 cups. And like we were saying, this is a dry recipe, so the traditional recipe doesn't have really any fat in it. So no butter, no lard, no oil, and the modern recipe does at about 3/4 of a cup. And lastly, the modern recipe is finished with powdered sugar, so it's more of a confectionery, and the traditional isn't finished with anything. Now let's take a look at the spices. So we see that the spices in the traditional versus the modern stay the same. We have cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, anise, black pepper, citrus, but the amounts are pretty different, and we'll get back to that in just a sec. But first, let's take a look at what these spices do. Of course, this is all in terms of humoral medicine, and humoral medicine's herbal energetics are defined in terms of hot, cold, wet, and dry. And we can see that all of these herbs are hot and dry. That means that they're going to treat conditions that are cold and damp. And we see they have an affinity towards specific organs. And so we're looking at a human body seen as having similar temperature and moisture qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry, but those qualities are held in different combinations in the humors of yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. Yellow bile being hot and dry, black bile being cold and dry, phlegm being cold and wet, and blood being warm and wet. And when we see the organs listed, we need to remember that these are not the modern anatomical organs, but the humoral organs. Same physical thing, but different function. So what does cold and damp mean in humoral medicine? Well, cold means slowed digestion, weak appetite, feeling chilled easily, especially after eating, poor circulation, so cold hands and feet, and just an overall sense of sluggishness. Of course, cold here, we are referring to cold in the digestion itself. Cold other places would manifest with different symptoms. And dampness here is a heaviness in the body. Somebody's prone to bloating and gas. There are loose or sticky stools. There's a lot of mucus production, especially thick mucus. Brain fog is really common, and there's a dullness and heaviness of the head. And overall, there's a sense of things not clearing out of the body very quickly. So sluggishness of the bowels, maybe a little urinary irregularity, constant runny nose. And when you put all those together, cold and damp look like you eat food and it just sits there. You get full really quickly, and because you're getting full quickly, you feel kind of bloaty, crampy, gassy. There can be a lot of mucus, as we said, runny nose, but mucus can happen all over the place. So you can certainly have mucus in the bowel movement in this kind of presentation. And the person is going to be low energy, especially after eating, especially in the winter. They're not really going to have much of a tolerance for cold so much. And one hallmark of phlegm or cold and dampness is just this kind of pervasive feeling of heaviness. The body just feels heavy, heavy limbs. The body can feel a little puffy, and there's a heavy quality to the mind as well. You can subjectively feel like your mind just isn't working as quickly as you think it should. Now let's take a look at the amounts of the spices. That's the huge difference between modern and pre-modern recipes, just the sheer amount. These pre-modern cookies are very spice forward, very acrid, aromatic, and hot. And again, they're not very sweet or fatty. And that means these cookies aren't for sitting on the couch in your sweatpants watching old Christmas movies. They aren't 3 a.m. comfort food. No, these cookies had some real kick. They come from winter in pre-modern Europe, and that means cold. Not as cold as the Midwest and the United States, not as cold as Canada, certainly not as cold as Russia or Scandinavia. No, but it's just warm enough to be damp, and that damp cold sinks into your bones and joints, and you feel like you can never warm up. It is, as the Germans say, Scheisswetter. And now we can look at the areas of effect of these cookies. The spices in them target all of the digestive and mucosal organs. Every single one of them goes to the stomach as the primary organ. And in humoral medicine, digestion is seen to happen primarily in the stomach. So that makes sense here. And there's also some that go to the intestines. And if we want to understand what's going on from a modern point of view, these spices increase gastric secretions, they stimulate the release of pancreatic enzymes and promote gastric emptying and encourage peristalsis. So they increase digestive tone and move things along, and that relieves bloating, fullness, and gas. They also increase microcirculation, so more blood in the GI, and also more peripheral microcirculation, so your capillaries at the surface of the body open, and that helps to relieve a kind of pervasive sense of surface level chill, muscle aches, and tightness and stiffness of the joints. Particularly cinnamon does that. Some of these also go to the lungs, where they clear phlegm and open the bronchioles, so anise in particular does that. And some go to the brain. Now, what does it mean to say that it goes to the brain? Because that's kind of an odd statement, and we don't think of foods and spices as going to the brain in modern terms. What we're getting at there is, again, this presentation has a kind of mental fatigue to it. And in humoral medicine, this is described as cold vapors of the stomach misting the mind, and thereby slowing cognitive process by being cold and damp. The analogy here is fog in the lowlands or a bog. It rises up from the cold and wet ground and just hangs in the air. And in this case, the stomach should be on the hotter and drier side. But instead, it's weak, it's impaired, so it's cold and wet. But leaving the description of the mechanism aside, this points to a symptom cluster of mental sluggishness with a heavy feeling in the body and probably feelings of cold. And this is often accompanied by a weak digestion. So bloating, gas, fullness, tiredness after eating, and often a runny nose. And these herbs all increase mental activation by increasing sympathetic nervous system tone. So not only do they boost your metaphoric digestive fire, they clear the mind. So to sum up, we see we are warming and drying in every single cavity or location of the body, upper, middle, and lower, the brain and lung, the stomach, and the intestines. So now that we know what these cookies are doing, we can say who they would be good for. This is somebody who is phlegmatic, and that means cold and wet. Again, they feel cold, they feel heavy, they have a heavy body, they're mentally sluggish, slow digestion, loose bowels, tiredness after eating, either profuse urination that's clear or inhibited urination, but they feel puffy, like they're holding onto water under the skin. And I know I keep repeating these symptoms, but that's important because now we can contrast them against who these cookies are not for. And who they're not for is somebody who is hot and dry. In humoral medicine, that would be somebody who has a lot of yellow bile, particularly in the stomach. And this person looks like somebody who's always running hot, but that heat doesn't feel like a surface level heat. It doesn't feel like a flushing. It feels like a kind of core heat. And that means You're hot and also thirsty and also irritable. There is dry mouth, dry throat, more than likely dry lips. There could be dry skin too, but that can occur in a lot of different conditions. There would be a tendency towards constipation with dry, hard stools. So this is dry, hard stool constipation, not sluggish bowel constipation. And there would be a tendency towards acid reflux or a sense of burning digestion. The person would also have a red or flushed face, probably some difficulty falling asleep, maybe waking up around 1 or 3 in the morning. And they could have a dry cough or throat with a bitter taste in the throat. Lastly, there could be a tendency to nosebleeds if the dryness is bad. Now, we said these are medicinal cookies. They are in line with humoral tradition and inspired by humoral formulas. And we can see this cookie architecture at play in older humoral formulas. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. First, we'll take a look at diazinzaberos. And this is listed as beneficial against hoarseness of the throat, dryness of cough, thirst arising from the stomach, palpitations, and pain of the side. So the ingredients are pretty similar. It just includes tregan which is the gum of an astragalus species. And it's included here importantly because it is cold and moist. And here it is meant to balance the heating aspect of the other spices and mitigate side effects. It also has sugar, honey, and licorice. And all of those also help to moisten what would be a dry condition and to moderate the heat of the spicy herbs. So they prevent the herbs from being too drying. And licorice appearing in this formula is also something that is often seen in classical Chinese formulas that have similar accurate herbal combinations. Some of these formulas add figs, and then you start to see combinations that really do look very similar to certain classical Chinese formulas that have a backbone of fresh ginger, jujube dates, and licorice. Here, instead of the fresh ginger, using dry ginger or galangal, instead of the jujube, using figs, and of course, keeping the licorice. At least I've seen that a couple times, but I don't know how common that actually is, so I have to be careful that I'm not doing any kind of cross-medical system projecting. The dosage is about 17.5 grams per herb, but these are mixed with honey and rolled into balls about the size of a hazelnut. There's 9 powdered herbs, so I'm guessing that's about 0.5 gram per herb. So that would be a very moderate, mild formula, likely taken over time. And that's important to note because too much mace, nutmeg, or cloves can give you some pretty bad side effects. The formula name, diazinzaberos, has 2 parts. Dia meaning made with, and zinzaberos meaning ginger. So that means made with ginger. There is also powder douce, or Duke's powder, which was a common spice blend in late medieval Europe. And this spice blend is really similar to the Pfeffernüsse cookie spice blend. There are a lot of variations, of course, but the common ingredients were 3 tablespoons of ginger, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1.5 tablespoons of cinnamon, a teaspoon of cloves, and a teaspoon of nutmeg. So for all intents and purposes, you could say that Pfeffernüsse cookies were powder douce made in cookie form. And with Duke's powder, you could make Hippocras, which for all intents and purposes was mulled wine. From Les Ménagères de Paris, I am undoubtedly mispronouncing that. This was a 14th century manuscript. We have, to make powdered Hippocras, take a 1/4 ounce of very fine cinnamon, hand-picked by tasting it, 1 ounce of very fine ginger, and 1 ounce of grains of paradise, 1/6 of an ounce of nutmeg and galangal together, and pound it all together. And when you want to make hippocras, take a good ½ ounce or more of this powder and 2/4 ounces of sugar and mix them together, and a quart of wine as measured in Paris. And note that the powder and sugar mixed together make Duke's powder. So there you have it. These types of spice blends were quite common, and especially in confections. And what we have today in traditional European cookies are the softened and toned down version of late medieval medicinal formulas. We've kept mostly the same ingredients, but we use less of them and now as flavors rather than medicines. So the next time you eat a Pfeffernüsse or Lebkuchen or a Springerle, remember you're going back in time and tasting a rich herbal tradition preserved in cookie form. And that's pretty cool. I'll leave the cookie recipe below, both the modern and the traditional. If you want to try it, let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, if you enjoy this kind of content, please remember to like and subscribe for more herbal deep dives. Thanks, and happy holidays.